request. And so in order, I'd like to introduce pre-registered public commenters, the first of which is Sarah McNamee, who has a friend presenting a statement.
Hello, everyone. All right, as Jason mentioned, I'll be speaking on behalf of Sarah McNamee, so I'll start her oral comment here. I'd like to thank ICER for this opportunity to speak at today's meeting. My name is Sarah McNamee, and I was a research participant in the MDMA arm of the MAP1 trial. I'm also a licensed psychotherapist, and I've worked in trauma research for over a decade. Over the years, I've met at least a dozen other MAPS trial participants. Their stories aren't mine to tell, but what's beyond any doubt, given the number of people I've met and the things they've told me, is that the published data on MDMA-assisted therapy and the stories we hear in the media are at best woefully incomplete. While I was in the study, there were many things that my trial therapists did, things I accepted because I believed they were experts, because I wanted to heal, because they said this was a paradigm-shifting treatment, and because of the MDMA they gave me. Things I would never condone as a therapist or as a researcher. The list is too long to fully cover in this format, but it includes things like encouraging me to view my worsening symptoms as evidence of healing and, quote, spiritual awakening, seeding mistrust in mainstream psychiatry, introducing concepts like past life traumas, encouraging and, at one time, pressuring me to cuddle with them, repeatedly telling me I was, quote, helping make history, and that I was, quote, part of a movement, viewing my boundaries as psychological resistance, and letting me know how my responses and behaviors during and after the trial could jeopardize legalization. Most therapists I know who aren't involved in psychedelics react strongly when they look into the Lykos MDMA therapy protocol. Not because they're anti-drug or closed-minded, but because 100 years of psychotherapy research and practice tells us that some of the methods and approaches in the Lykos manual can lead to serious harms. The Lykos MDMA therapy manual endorses the use of controversial and unproven approaches, and furthermore uses them with patients in highly vulnerable and suggestible states. 3 months after I was given my first dose of MDMA, I was, for a time, one of the staunchest advocates for MDMA therapy. The problem is that I was also suicidal and clinically decompensating in drastic and unprecedented ways. Like others I've spoken to, I tried telling my MAPS therapists about my worsening state, but I couldn't seem to get through to them. 2 of us at different sites were told by our therapists that they, quote, predicted we would be feeling better in 6 months' time. You'll hear many folks say it's okay for MAPS Lykos not to report on things they were aware of, but that weren't picked up by their outcome measures. In a world of technicalities, maybe that's true, but it doesn't change how important it is for people who are thinking of taking MDMA with a therapist to know that things can and do go wrong, that even in MAPS trials, this treatment has created unimaginable suffering, even for those who are reported to have improved. It's important for their doctors, therapists, friends, and family to know. And it's important for other researchers to know, because at least in my opinion, the problem isn't that MDMA causes these problems. It's that what therapists say and do, or don't say and don't do while people are on MDMA has significant effects that can lead to healing, to harm, and from what I've seen and experienced, to a very complicated mix of both. These are not problems that should be pushed down the road and addressed after FDA approval, as several MAPS researchers and therapists, including my own study team, have personally told me. At stake here is not really whether or not MDMA therapy can help people with trauma. Nobody who's taken a serious look at these trials can test this, and neither do I. ICER's report on MDMA therapy for PTSD clearly says that, while they found evidence of problems, they couldn't determine their frequency. I agree with this perspective. Dr. Jennifer Mitchell, in comments to the press, said that ICER's conclusions were based on a partial investigation, so do not show the full picture. I also agree with this. There are too many unknowns here. The issue at stake is about the quality of the data, the completeness of it. It would be in everyone's best interest for the problems in phase 3 MAPS trials to be fully investigated by an independent third party including interviews with trial participants to better ascertain the ability of trial protocols to detect worsening and emerging symptoms, and investigations into the psychotherapy component of these trials. In this way, the questions about the quality of the research can be put to rest once and for all, the problems can be addressed, and the research can move forward. Ultimately, if MDMA therapy is approved as current protocols stand, we're looking at potentially increasing the burden of illness for countless people with PTSD and making a suffocating mental illness even more difficult to live with and treat, as the MAPS trials have done for a portion of their participants. Trauma survivors deserve better. Thank you.
Thank you, and to you and to Sarah McNamee for that and for joining us. I'll move on to Dr. Lily Ross.
Thank you so much for inviting me to comment today. My name is Lily K. Ross. I was a creator, reporter, and host for the Cover Story Power Trip podcast, and I'm also a person who has experienced remission from severe and debilitating PTSD symptoms as a result of taking MDMA, which I took in the underground with a facilitator in 2013. When Dave Nichols and I began our investigation that later became Power Trip, we were looking at abuse in the psychedelic underground. We didn't expect to delve into the clinical trials. Like many members of the public, we assumed that the quality of the MAPS, now Lykos, MDMA AP research was solid. It was Megan Buisson's work that changed the course of our investigation. Megan is the woman who had the courage to publish footage of her therapist abusing her during the MAPS Phase 2 clinical trial. Long before that, she unearthed a litany of methodological and ethical issues in the MAPS clinical trials. She found these issues because while she was in the trial, her therapists made her their trial coordinator. Her analysis and the documents she showed us led us to experts who helped us to verify her concerns and add to the list. They helped us to understand the myriad issues that riddle these trials, from methodological flaws, the poor quality of the data, and the dearth of participants, which make it impossible to determine the safety and efficacy of MDMA AP at this time. Ours is a biased view. Dave and I are in a position where we have heard and continue to hear stories about the horrible things people do involving psychedelics and the silencing of harms by institutions leading the psychedelic renaissance. Stories of therapists crossing boundaries, laying on patients, sexual assault, yelling, manipulation, abandoning them alone on drugs. The list goes on. The public has no idea what the world of psychedelic therapy condones as normal behavior. These behaviors have been justified under the umbrella of exposure therapies, somatic therapies, and more, but the psychotherapy experts that we have consulted tell us that this couldn't be further from what these evidence-based practices are supposed to look like. We've talked to victim survivors of the Lykos clinical trials trying to pull together the funds to afford therapy, even as their trial experience leaves them afraid to trust therapists and less able to earn an income than before the trial. I've been swimming in the trial material for over 3 years now, trying to understand how so much media hype can be based on such poor quality science. MAPS's founder has been explicit that his strategy is, quote, political science. His goal has been to change the public's mind about psychedelics. And his strategy has worked. The underground is booming, as are expensive training courses on how to, quote, guide psychedelic trips, marketed to licensed clinicians and unqualified lay people, despite the absence of empirically derived knowledge to inform this work. There is no research-based answer to the question of what constitutes psychedelic psychotherapy. It's paramount that high-quality research into MDMA AP be conducted by a CRO, and that the field encourages healthy debate in order to establish sound clinical and ethical norms. Clinicians need to understand outcomes and risks so they can administer evidence-based care and have appropriate informed consent conversations with their patients. In our investigation, we reviewed the patient-specific data that several participants had requested and obtained from Lykos. Some of these participants were in the MAP1 trial published in Nature. There were 46 people in the MDMA arm of the trial. Our sources were among 28 people whom Lykos claims no longer met diagnostic criteria for PTSD. They constitute 7% of that group. Put another way, At least 7% of those who reported outcomes which the researchers interpreted to mean they no longer had PTSD actually got worse, suicidally worse, and we're still trying to heal from that same trial long after the Nature article was published. When they consented to being human research subjects, they believed that any negative outcomes they might experience would be part of the scientific record and used to benefit others, but they haven't been. Their stories highlight the failure of the psychedelic research community to get curious about negative outcomes and side effects for the sake of future patients. Instead of properly reporting and investigating adverse events and SAEs, multiple reports and documents show MAPS and LICO staff doing quote unquote mental gymnastics to dismiss those events as quote not drug related. This is injurious to the participants and deprives the medical community of information it needs to improve and assess safety. All we're really asking for is rigorous research that prioritizes patient safety over a quote movement, and for a full and independent investigation of past trials, and for the psychedelic research community to do better in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ross, for joining us, and thank you for your comments. Are there questions for Dr. Ross from the CEPAC panel? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to move on to Jesse Gould, who is president and founder of the Heroic Hearts Project. And if you could just begin by stating any conflicts, we can go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Jesse Gould. Only conflict, I run a nonprofit connecting veterans to psychedelic treatments. Hello, thank you for providing me the chance to present today. As I said, my name is Jesse Gould. I'm a former Army Ranger with 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan, and I'm currently the founder of a nonprofit called Heroic Hearts Project. I was one of the people that the ICER team reached out to for perspective on the psychedelic field. I have to say I was a bit shocked and disappointed when the preliminary report came out, because I did not see my perspectives or what I brought up that I shared with the team reflected in the report at all. I'm here today to share my major concerns with the report and provide you all with the main perspectives that I believe we're missing. And that's a perspective of the individual on the ground that desperately needs these treatments. I'm here to represent the voices of millions of veterans who, after bravely serving their country, find themselves in a position where they have to constantly beg for common sense treatments. For the past 7 years, I've been on the front line of the veteran suicide epidemic. The current estimate is anywhere from 17 to 24 veterans commit suicide each day in this country. Some estimates go as high as 44 a day. Today, more veterans have died from suicide than died from the last 20 years of combat by more than a factor of 15. And reports like this have real consequences for real humans who are suffering every day with little to no hope. This by no means implies that we should just rubber stamp things like the MDMA trial, but we absolutely should observe it in a greater context. And context is what I found to be completely absent from this report. I'm sure there were some flaws in the study, like all studies, and I'll leave that to the experts on both sides to focus on the validities of those critiques. But these studies do not happen in a vacuum, and so context is essential, especially with something as high profile as MDMA. I do not believe these larger contexts will reflect in the report, even though they are absolutely important to the conversation. The main missing context in this is the institution of the drug approval itself. This report calls into question the reported efficacy of MDMA because it cannot properly be double-blinded. We are blaming the substance for not fitting into our evaluation process instead of acknowledging the shortcomings of the approval process itself. The fact of the matter is the FDA is not made for substances that do not have huge potential commercial value. The FDA process does not incentivize cures. There is no clear pathway for substances that do not fall into a clear scope. This is not to knock the FDA process itself, but we should acknowledge its inadequacies in assessing many substances that could greatly benefit humanity. Instead of undermining the MDMA process, perhaps we should be considering better approval processes for these types of substances. There's more to come, like psilocybin and other psychedelics that are going to hit these same walls. Without this context, how are we going to give an honest evaluation of MDMA? There are countless intelligent people here and involved with this report. It should not be the dumb Army grunt that has to point this out. The fact that despite all these systematic obstacles and the huge financial mountain, this unpatentable molecule has made it this far is quite amazing. Should we continue to ignore handfuls of other substances that could prove beneficial to humanity because they cannot be double-blinded? The other important context that is missing is the understanding the broader landscape of approved treatments for PTSD and the impacts of derailing potentially one of the biggest breakthroughs ever in treating PTSD. If not MDMA, there really is nothing else out there in the pipeline. So yes, there may be flaws in the study, but what is the risk reward of potentially saving millions of lives? Do the risks that are outlined in the MDMA report really outweigh the enormous potential benefit? Was this cost benefit even considered in this report? Remember, 17 to 24 veterans commit suicide every day, and the current treatments are just not working. Nothing has stemmed the suicide epidemic. So what is the point of medicine if we cannot connect it to the actual lives it's affecting? In my time in the psychedelic space, I have personally witnessed thousands of veterans heal after nearly giving up hope. I've also seen consistent obstacles and roadblocks coming from reports like these, petitions from academics, opposition to bills from major organizations. At the same time, I have not seen the same level of outcry around over-medication of veterans or honest conversations about the limitations and potential major risks of our current treatment protocols. The voices that should be leaders in this field are falling short. It is easy for research to default to moving slow when it loses connection to the actual lives it might be impacting. I hope today I've provided and reestablished some of those connections to the people that this is affecting. And thank you for the time to speak today.
Thank you for your comments and thank you for being here. Any questions from the CEPAC panel? Dr. Wadero, Rishi.
Thanks so much for that really vital perspective, Mr. Gold. One question I had is, and again, just based on your sort of boots on the ground, frontline experience doing this work for a long time, you spoke to the many veterans who you've seen benefit from MDMA therapy. I was just wondering if you've also, with that same frontline experience, seen any harms that have concerned you.
With the veterans that we've served, I've seen harms in the broader psychedelic space, and that's more because of a lack of infrastructure and a lack of the trained therapists. From the other people's perspective, there are cases of bad players. I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater because there are people who take advantage or who are not good therapists and are doing these things inappropriately. That has no reflection on the actual efficacy of these substances. What we're seeing is people are so desperate that they're having to go to overseas. There's thousands of veterans that have to go overseas for life-saving care or underground. And when things are underground, that's when they're not discussed. That's when bad players come about. That's when there's no infrastructure, right? And so if we just keep holding off on these, we're preventing the conversation, we're preventing the infrastructure from coming. And again, there's just not proper infrastructure to properly study these things. And that's not the fault of the MDMA. That's not the fault of psilocybin coming, these other psychedelics. So there is, but it tends to be more of the fact of the lack of infrastructure and people not having other resources to actually do it. We should not, my nonprofit should not exist. The fact that veterans come to us, even though they have free healthcare from the VA, is indicative of this much wider problem that there is just not current resources for them. And we have people that are just on 10, 15 different medications that are still barely holding on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tara, Dr. Lavelle.
Hi, Mr. Gould. Yeah, thank you so much for this perspective. And I brought up earlier in our pre-meeting call that I just think this is such a, thinking about the veterans in space, such a vulnerable population. I guess I just want to follow up on the previous question in terms of infrastructure and whether you think that this is the right time to approve a medication like this, perhaps without, broader regulatory or other infrastructure oversight that may protect people from going through what some people say they went through in this trial, whether this is the right time to approve things without sort of broader protections, or whether those broader protections should be in place to make sure that some of these harms don't get replicated on a broader scale. I guess that's part of my concern surrounding this, but I'd love to hear your perspective on it.
I think everything that's brought up are valid concerns, but we also have to work in the real world situation, right? If we wait for these things, and then that's that risk reward of how many lives are going to be impacted from something that can potentially help them. And just by the nature of these being Schedule 1 substances and the insurmountable obstacles that, miraculously this did overcome, those are not going to roll out in the way we want them to. So it's not like magically, if we just delay this, that all of a sudden there's going to be this safe infrastructure that mitigates all the concerns we have. That's just not going to happen. So really the question is, are we delaying this and then all those lives that are impacted? In the meantime, we are working on the infrastructure. We have to go over all these obstacles. It is happening, but the way that this stuff flourishes is because we keep the stigma around it. We keep these from actually being declared medical benefit, having medical benefit. When we start declaring them, then that actually opens up federal funding, that opens up more conversations about this. The VA is ready to incorporate this to some degree. So those concerns are going to be addressed, but right now there's just such a wall because of the scheduling one. And that's not a question of more investigations into this, the perfect trial. None of that's going to exist, and none of that's going to resolve this. So this is that cost benefit of, do we think this is actually beneficial? Does the research show that? And what's the timeline that we're actually having the greater effect? This is the balance. We're not in this perfect situation. Unfortunately, the way drugs are scheduled, it does put us in this artificial context that is not ideal, but there's no situation that will be ideal. And so that's where this overall broader context assessment needs to happen, which is what I didn't see happening.
Great. Thank you.
Dr. Harlefson, I think you have a comment.
Thank you. Thank you for your perspective, Mr. Gold. I have a question to you regarding the VA and DoD treatment guideline for PTSD. This guideline pinpoints that given the resource-intensive nature of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, if the VA and DoD is to implement this treatment, it would probably have negative impacts on access for other patients. So I wonder what's your perspective on this?
Can you elaborate on that? Like how does it have negative impacts on other patients?
As pinpointed in the ICER report and pinpointed by other reports as well, the psychotherapy component of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy is 4 to 5 times as big as already existent evidence-based treatments. So if we are to implement MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, this would need a lot of resources. And the VA and DoD treatment guideline has pinpointed that all these resources will probably affect other patients besides PTSD patients in a negative way.
Okay, I understand now. And, again, this goes to a problem. Should we not give people more effective treatments because it's more resource intensive? If we look at the statistics coming out of the VA, the current treatments of talk therapy and SSRIs, one has a pretty abysmal success rate, and 2 ends up having people on these medications for decades, and then it tends to lead to multiple other medications. It's not uncommon, and this is not an exaggeration, of people coming to us on 10 to 15 different medications and losing hope. And then not to mention all the negative side effects there. And so if we're doing this cost benefit of, well, we can give more people bad treatment versus we can start progressing to more positive treatments and put the pressure on the VA and the DoD to actually fund that, I'm always going to fall in that other camp. If there's anything even close to what we're seeing with the MAPS trials of the 67% success rate for the treatment resistant people, then that's a huge breakthrough in terms of what we're currently seeing. And the veterans absolutely deserve this. So let's put the ball in the DoD's court to fund this, to actually give the resources to the veterans that need it most. We cannot just say, well, let's just settle for the really bad, mediocre treatments that we have been, because look at the veteran suicide rate. There's been nothing that has curtailed that. And so do we want to stay in that situation, or do we want to actually progress? It's going to take some growing pains, but that's on the government. And when you actually indicate that MDMA does have medical benefit, then it puts more pressure on them to actually fund this. If we keep kind of going in this purgatory of, no, this needs more research, then we don't make any progress and we're in the same sort of boat. So there is that case. There's also, I will say, other bills in momentum that can potentially help the VA with offsites, that it can potentially put more funding, but it requires that there is this approval for it. So these are already in motion. That's what us on the ground are doing on a state basis, on a federal basis. But these kind of things where we're just like, let's say we're at, completely stymie what we're trying to do.
Thank you. Thank you so much for these comments, which are so helpful. And thank you for the thoughtful questions. With that, we're going to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Neshe Devino.
My name is Neshe Devino, and I'm a researcher at Johns Hopkins University with expertise in psychedelic bioethics and no conflicts. Alongside colleagues, including Megan Buisson, I co-authored a citizen petition to extend the public hearing at FDA's upcoming advisory committee meeting. I'd like to thank ICER for the opportunity to speak today. Last week, I submitted a written comment to the FDA that demonstrates how the MAPS Lykos Inner Circle qualifies as a therapy cult that indoctrinates its therapists and participants into an ideological system of true beliefs. Therapy cults transform therapeutic and personality theories into rigid ideology that promises reductive solutions for healing. Despite specific patterns of iatrogenic harm, therapy cults encourage adherents to view themselves as heroes struggling against ignorant forces to bring enlightenment to humanity. The prospect of a therapy cult guiding a suggestibility-enhancing drug through clinical trials highlights unique risks that have never been publicly discussed. The trials should be scrutinized as if Scientology or NXIVM had submitted a new drug application to the FDA. This analysis has explanatory power for idiosyncrasies and allegations that are too consistent to be dismissed as hearsay or coincidence. It connects everything from the rosy published outcomes to the organization's internal culture, to the specific nature of the abuses in its clinical trials, to the allegations of data misconduct, to ICER's cited claim that it's more like a religious movement than a scientific organization. The MAPS Lykos protocol obscures their actual healing ideology, which introduces unacknowledged and unmitigated risks for participants. Significant elements of their actual protocol are only revealed elsewhere, such as in the 2023 book, Integral Psychedelic Therapy. Two of the book's editors were MAPS trainers, and it was endorsed by prominent members of MAPS's inner circle, including Rick Doblin, Bia Labate, Michael Midhofer, and Marcella Odalora. In one of the book's case studies, Veronica Gold, a MAPS trainer and supervisor, advocates for the same kind of on-camera physical assault that Megan Buisson was subjected to during a phase 2 trial in 2015. Gold describes providing physical resistance to a client as the client, Annie, started to feel anger. Annie's distress escalated as her therapist pinned her down. She began to shout, quote, "Go away, get your fucking hands away from me," end quote. Gold insists that Annie's distressed attempts to stop the physical altercation were not genuine, since the client did not say a safe word that had been agreed to during preparation. Gold wrote, quote, "The words were clearly meant for her father. There was no confusion in my mind about how to proceed. Over the course of the next several minutes, she pushed my hands with increasing vigor and force," end quote. Vulnerable patients will be hurt by this ideology, just as the phase 2 participant was harmed. The fact that so many MAPS therapists and trainers signed off on this technique emphasizes that their ideology in practice condones assault, and it's premised on a flawed model of consent. It conditions participants to blame themselves for forgetting a safe word during a panic attack, and to believe that their duty is to submit to suffering. While researchers correctly criticize the MAPS Lykos protocol for introducing too much variability, they miss how its flexibility provides cover for all too consistent cultic practices that engineer artificial consent. They also miss how broken blinding creates targets for manipulation in a research culture that normalizes love bombing and indoctrination. In the weeks since I submitted my comment, I received 3 confirmations of separate predictions for my analysis. One came from a new phase 3 participant. I learned later that Veronica Gold was one of her therapists. I'm sharing her words here with permission. She wrote me, quote, "Since the study, I have woken from flashback nightmares, kicking and yelling for my original perpetrator to get off me, mixed with the memory of my MAPS therapist standing over me with a pillow and trying to kick her off me, as she had me do in the tape-recorded session. It's been overwhelming, confusing, and exhausting. But worse has been waking up in thick, sludgy shame, knowing I failed the study and the rare opportunity I was given to heal, as all the success stories are blaring in the news," end quote. I thank ICER for calling attention to these issues. To take them seriously, all of the videotapes throughout MAPS's clinical trials must be independently reviewed. Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate your comments and appreciate your expertise. Questions from the panel? Okay, let's move on to the last public commenter, Megan Buisson, who is an independent researcher. And I think you actually we have like 6 minutes. We're going to extend the time.
Thank you. Can everyone see me okay? Did I do this right?
Okay. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Every morning I wake up and I wish I hadn't. My first thoughts are always about him. I don't like the word rapist, but therapist is not appropriate. Although really they're one and the same. After all, with nothing but a sharp intake of breath, therapist becomes the rapist. And this is where I pause every single time I try to sift through this mess. I pause, reminding myself that it's not his weight, rather the weight of the world crushing my chest. I want to scream, and I can't. Because any hint of anger on my part will be pathologized by the trial sponsor. My name is Megan Buisson. I am an academic in the field of public health and social policy, a paramedic first responder, and a phase 2 clinical trial participant. While in the clinical trial, I was simultaneously exploited as a research assistant to the extent that I gained access to the end of phase 2 FDA submission. I identified multiple methodological and ethical concerns that have since been detailed in many locations, including the ICER report. Among other things, I also spoke out about my own sexual abuse. Regarding the details of my abuse, I will not be outlining them here. As I'm sure many of you are aware, there is a short video clip that is available online. And the fact that that and my name are even public is extremely difficult for me. It is a decision that came about as a direct result of Lykos's efforts to bury the truth about the harms that were being done to me and so many others. When my MDMA sessions ended, I was actively suicidal. I was told that Lykos therapists were aware this was happening to participants, and in the absence of any formal consideration for participant well-being, many were continuing to treat their subjects. In my own trial, this was the case for at least 5 of the 6 participants. My sericists cited several other therapists as precedents, indicated they had confirmed it with Lykos, and suggested it as an option. I had no alternatives. And when I moved to Cortez, I was overwhelmingly vulnerable. On Cortez, every outside connection shattered. They dictated who I could talk to, spend time with, what I could say. They controlled my income and my medical care. I was repeatedly threatened, drugged, exploited, and assaulted. At least 12 therapists, including 3 involved with phase 3 trials, visited Cortez during that time and saw what was happening. But when it came to stopping it, I was on my own. It took a year and multiple attempts amid escalating abuse before I finally managed to escape. And the RCMP ultimately recommended 8 criminal charges be laid due to the events on Cortez Island. It says a lot about Lykos's priorities that the sole point of contact for participants post-trial is their media coordinator. Heavily recruited to do interviews, I finally told Brad Burge no, specifically disclosing my sexual abuse. In response, he laughed, then warned me, "We don't want to be seen as overreacting now, do we? Or minimizing." I snapped back, because the last time I checked, sodomy was not listed as an FDA-approved tolerated side effect. There was a very, very long pause on the phone. And then MAPS's official response to me disclosing sexual abuse was Brad chirping, "Thank you for not going to the media." Click. And he hung up the phone. No one from Lykos ever followed up. The severe PTSD that brought me into this clinical trial went unaddressed and unresolved. All they did was pour a concrete foundation of new traumas over top. When I contacted Lycos for a second time, Lycos rallied a team of lawyers, then lied. These ongoing lies have been circulated by the press and wielded by trolls against me. These include details regarding a payment and a contentious statement of ethical violation. Regarding that statement, I spent months trying to get it corrected, specifically the erroneous detail that only one therapist was involved in my abuse. Even with clear evidence to the contrary, Lycos has refused to make the change, insisting their version, quote, makes MAPS look more sympathetic. Such self-serving obfuscation has directly benefited my perpetrators. My female therapist kept working for more than 7 years until her lawyer negotiated a quiet little resignation. She faced no disciplinary committee and there was no public record of her abuse. In a like manner, because being a registered psychologist, my male therapist simply lapsed his license prior to the trial. As a result, his lawyer successfully argued he held no fiduciary responsibility not to sexually abuse patients because he wasn't really a therapist. He was only pretending to play one in the MAPS clinical trial. To this day, Lycos refuses to use only licensed therapists. This egregious disregard for basic patient safety is so indoctrinated, Lycos' response to the ICER draft report openly flaunts it. There has never been any acknowledgement, investigation, or effort from Lycos to address its overwhelming institutionalized abuses and regulatory failures that led and perpetrated my harms. There is no question on whether what happened to me will happen again to someone else. It is only a matter of time. That doesn't negate the lived experience of those who say they may have benefited from this trial. It simply means they dodged a bullet. Even as this organization promotes itself as a global healer for trauma, its response to patients harmed in their own trials highlights a patent disregard for minimal standards of care and any genuine interest or capacity for trauma-informed practices. I have been repeatedly targeted and attacked. In the press, at conferences, and publications, Lycos stakeholders continue to frame my sexual assaults as a consensual relationship. They have done this by fabricating false diagnoses and simply blaming me. Researchers with Lycos have confirmed in writing that they are being ordered to do this by Lycos leadership. The truth is there is no consent in patient-therapist sexual abuse. Every single American and Canadian medical and psychological association is explicit and clear on this one. There is no consent. It is an exploitative, coercive, overwhelmingly abusive power dynamic. And no diagnosis will ever justify the use of sexual assault as a therapeutic modality. To the handful of journalists who have actually taken the time to understand and care about good media reporting on gender-based violence, thank you. When I spoke out, I took a stand when I could barely stand, and I stood strong. I did it as an academic and a first responder because I care a whole lot about evidence-based research, and I care about keeping people safe. And I did it also because I'm a woman with PTSD, and I understand really clearly what's at stake here. As far as I'm concerned, Lycos' response simply reiterates why speaking out was the right choice to make. And I'm glad I did. The irony about Lycos' therapist talks of the inner healer is that they refuse to listen. That is not my shame, and that is not my burden to hold. The truth is, for 18 months, my inner healer fought back. My inner healer screamed no. My inner healer insisted, you are not pretending to hurt me, you are hurting me. You are not pretending to assault me, you are assaulting me. You are not pretending to rape me, you are raping me. And I am alive today, and I am doing well today because I listened. The best thing my inner healer said to me across the time in that clinical trial was get the hell away from this cult. Thank you, ICER, for hearing my words.
Thank you for coming here today and sharing your story, and thanks to all of the public commenters for your availability and sharing your stories. And we honor the experiences of the tremendous burden of anyone who has experienced assault and trauma and PTSD. And we are appreciative for everyone who has come here today. We are now at the end of our public comment session. So I would ask from the ICER staff if there's any additional announcements before we break. But otherwise, our plan is to break for lunch, as you can see on the screen, and resume this session at 12:50 p.m. Today.
Thank you, Jason. We can go ahead and break. Okay, we are back. Just to reintroduce myself again, I'm Steve Pearson. I'm special advisor at ICER these days, and I will be moderating the voting session and the policy roundtable to follow. But I know most of you who are on the webinar will have been part of the meeting from the beginning and will have been part of the public comment session. And, we're going to be talking about randomization issues and unblinding and study protocols and outcome measures. And I just have to acknowledge the pain, the hopes, the fears, the despair, anger, all those things are part of the context here. And I'm just in awe of the courage and the eloquence of the people who came to provide public comment. So we will all have that in the back of our hearts and our minds as we talk about what will seem like more mundane issues. But again, they are part of the really important context, even though we are not the regulatory body that will decide yes or no, or some variation thereof. This discussion will deal with many of the same issues, and we'll hope to provide an additional forum in which, again, all of these different factors can be weighed together and talked about with a degree of transparency and honesty that I think will be good for patients and for our country. So I want to thank the CEPAC for their questions and their other kind of participation this morning, clinical experts and our patient experts, all of whom are with us as we go through the voting questions. And I will remind the CEPAC that the patient experts and clinical experts are available if you wish to direct specific thoughts or questions to them. And patient experts and clinical experts, you are also more than welcome to raise your hand and to make comments as we revisit the evidence and focus them into specific voting questions on both comparative effectiveness and on some of the benefits, potential benefits beyond health as they're measured in a trial, and some of the special ethical priorities that might kind of be another part of the important context here. So with that, I hope, again, the CEPAC is all set up with the voting.